Hey, Stewart's Chapel. Oh my goodness. This is Tuesday's devotion, and I'm glad I saved it towards the end of this series of devotions. Now, we're not at the end. I've got a whole section that I guess it'll be Thursday. I will have to move inside and because I want you to see it. I'm going to walk you through a chart from Ephesians about this calling to walk worthy. But that's Thursday. Before we get there, though, I want to deal with one of our callings that's always controversial. Some of you aren't going to like it. I understand that. Some of you got reasons and excuses why you don't want to do this calling. I understand that. If there's one thing you have found from the very beginning, starting with Jonah on, when God gives you a calling, you don't get to change it, negotiate it, delay it. You only get to choose to obey it, fulfill it, in other words, or rebel. But do not say that you're following Jesus when you're not doing what he calls you to do. Well, let's look at it. It's also in Ephesians. It's in Ephesians chapter 5. You can find it in Peter. You can find it in James. We've looked at it in James. It comes up. It seems to be an ugly word. The calling to, here it is. You ready? The calling to submit. Calling to submit. It's an ugly word, especially in a country like ours. Our country is built on individualism. Our country is built on our history of standing strong. The idea of submission is often misused by us and ignored by us. I'm not going to read all the passages. I'll start with verse 21 of Ephesians 5. Submitting to one another in the fear of God. That word fear is actually the Greek word phobia. It is a dreadful terror. That word comes up a lot in these scripture. I'm not going to read them all. Right after that, he says, wives, submit to your own husband as to the Lord. It doesn't tell her to submit to all men. It doesn't tell her to submit to all husbands. It just simply says to her to submit to her own husband. Verse 24, just like the church is submissive or in subjection to Christ. Wow. Jump down to chapter 6. Children are to obey or to submit themselves to their parents. Slaves, bondservants. Bondservants are called to submission, to subjection, especially in Peter, more so than Ephesians, to their masters, to their bosses, to their employers. In Peter and other places, it tells us that that same kind of submission is to all authorities. And he even says, especially to those who are over you in the Lord, which would be ministers and church leaders. Submission is hard. The word submission here is a military term. It means to willfully put yourself under the authority of. In James, if you'll remember, we are called to submit to God. So what does this submission, this calling of God, if I were to flesh it out for us, what's it look like? Well, first of all, it's to God. Just like the church is to Christ, it is submission to God. Therefore, whenever I fail to submit to those that he calls me to submit to, then I am no longer submitting to him. Did you hear that? Anytime that I fail to submit to whom God tells me to submit to, then I am not submitting to God. So it's a submission to God. It's a submission to one another. And again, remember from yesterday, the one another are those that we love, or those not to those we love, but to those who are the family of God, other Christians. But he also breaks it down, and if I were to give a third gathering or a third category of submission, first to God, then to other believers, to one another, and then third, to authorities. He defines those authorities. Husbands, parents, church leaders, governments, masters or employers. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, none of us are called to lord over anyone. So therefore, anyone that is another Christian, I have no control over the government. No control over what the lost people do, even a lost boss. But if I'm a person of authority and I'm a believer, then I must always remember my calling. And that is, I am not to be like lost people. I am not to make it difficult for submission. That would be true of a Christian husband. That would be true of a pastor. That would be true of a church leader. That would be true of a Christian politician or leader. That would be true of a Christian boss. They are not to lord over. Their example is not a worldly example. Their example is God. It's Christ, who humbled himself and became a man, who left all in order for us, came to be the suffering servant, not just the servant, but the suffering servant. So this passage, this calling to submit, is not a blank check for pastors, church leaders, husbands, Christian bosses, or for anyone. Our example is Christ. But even in that, submission doesn't come easy. You see, that's why you and I have such a hard time with sin. We really want to do what we want to do. We don't want to submit to God. Oh, we're all right submitting to God when it's convenient for us, or we think it's in our best interests, or something we want to do. Do you understand that if you only submit when you want to, you're not submitting? Listen to that very carefully. When you only submit when it's convenient for you, you really haven't submitted. Because submission means dying to self. And the fact that you only submit when it's convenient to you means that yourself is very, very big. Oh my goodness. So do I have a problem with submission? You better believe it. I have a problem with submission. The battle rages within me. I find myself like the Israelites, one day following God and the next day not. One day submitting, the next day not. Our commission and our calling is to submit. It has nothing to do with whether it's easy or not. So don't think that this is a devotion to rebuke a wife or children has no intention. In fact, the fingers are more on the one in authority. All eyes are right there. Will they be like Christ, or will they be like the world? Love you, Stewart's Chapel.